the Just Stop Oil group obviously is well known to many people because of their antics in various locations that has frankly annoyed huge quantities of people. They've got a cause they believe in, rightly or wrongly, in terms of the cause they're fighting for. But it seems to me that the more of these antics that go on, the more they are, in a sense, losing potential support. So I'm delighted now to be joined by a supporter of Just Stop Oil, Dr. Kush Naker, I hope I pronounced that right, who is on the line. Good morning to you. Good afternoon. Thanks for being with us. So the latest antic yesterday at the rugby final at Twickenham, a couple of your colleagues rushing on, throwing the orange paint. All it's doing is irritating people and putting people off your cause, isn't it?
Well, I think we need to put what happened yesterday into context. First of all, the people who ran onto the pitch, one of them is a GP, a colleague of mine, Dr. Patrick Hart, who is an incredibly kind and loving person. And he feels that he has no choice but to take action like this to try and draw attention to the climate crisis that unfortunately our government is still not tackling adequately.
We'll come on to the climate point separately, but the point is these antics, and there's nothing kind and compassionate at disrupting 80,000 people who've paid good money to go and watch a match. That's not kind and compassionate. That's damn selfish, frankly. But these antics are now putting people off. You've disrupted the snooker. You've disrupted people's ability to go to work. If you want to gain support for your cause, then you're going the wrong way about it.
Well, I don't see what is selfish about some people running onto a rugby pitch to throw some powder around. Both of the people that took that action yesterday have now been taken into police custody and are being held on remand. So they are getting nothing out of this. The reason that they're doing this is because of, for example, the girl that is in the background picture here is Ella, who's 9 years old and who died in 2013 because of air pollution caused by the climate crisis. On her death certificate, the coroner actually put air pollution as the trigger to her death. And
if that's the lady Ella who you're talking about from London, there is actually many other related issues and conditions to that. That's got nothing to do with disrupting 80,000 people in a rugby match.
But how else do you get the government to take action? We know that
the government's already got a net zero target.
Democracy are not working, then protest is what people need to.
Kush, you're basically saying that it's okay to obstruct and disrupt and break the law, even though the government's already passed a law to get to net zero by 2050, which most other countries in the world haven't done because it's incredibly stupid.
Well, there's nothing stupid about trying to get to net zero by 2050, because I think that is absolutely vital for us to try and protect any chance of a livable future. If you look at
let's dig into the detail. Let's dig into the detail. China hasn't committed to doing that. China's talking about reducing emissions. They might get somewhere near it by 2060. India's saying 2070. We represent less than 1% of global emissions. Why should we impoverish ourselves, make ourselves poorer and colder, and old cold people die early to get to 2050?
So we do need China and India to take action, but I am a British citizen, so my actions will be directed against my government first and foremost, and it's only after we get our own house into accord that we can go around telling other countries what they should do. And absolutely, China and India need to take more role.
And if we get to net zero, what happens?
Well, what we've seen over the last 30 years is that we have managed to bring down emissions and grow the economy at the same time. So I don't accept the argument that we need to shrink our economy and impoverish people in order to get to net zero.
In the last decade, right, when we've been pushing forward with some of these policies, we've had the lowest growth decade in the last 60 years. So actually, there is a huge financial cost. People have never felt colder and poorer as a result of the net zero obligations. But I'll just ask you again, what happens scientifically?
Huge financial costs.
Right, so what happens...
It will cost us about 61 trillion to get the world economy to net zero and 100% renewable.
What happens when we get...
That pays for itself in 6 years.
What happens when we get to net zero?
6 years.
No, it doesn't. What happens when we get to net zero?
Yes, it does. So, I can show you research from Stanford University.
Just answer my questions. You're on my show. Yeah. Does climate change stop when we get to net zero?
No, we need to remain at net zero.
So, but you're saying climate change goes on,
and then we remain at net zero.
But does the climate change stop or does it continue?
Human-caused climate change stops.
So was there no climate change before CO2 emissions 150 years ago?
No, of course there was climate change.
There we are. Right, you accept that climate change goes on.
The climate change that is happening now is far greater than anything we've seen before.
Really?
Yes.
So what about 3,000 years ago, when the temperature in the UK was about 2 degrees warmer than it currently is, 2 degrees warmer, and we were growing grapes for delicious claret in Yorkshire? We've coped with warmer temperatures before.
It's about the rate of change and whether or not humans are able to adapt to that.
And we're perfectly able to adapt to it.
I'm afraid that that's not the case. Because if you look at all of the projections as to how many people will come to harm as a result of the climate crisis, it is millions of people that will die. And
how will millions of people die? Will we all get flooded because of sea level rise?
Because of famines, because of wildfires. Are you just denying that the human-caused climate change even exists?
Kush, I'm going to ask Aaron to put up the graph I've got. In the last 100 years, because of extreme weather events, 96% less people die every year because of extreme weather events than 100 years ago. And by the way, there's no increase in things like tornadoes and hurricanes in the last 70 or 80 years. I've got data and graphs that show that. So the extreme weather events are not increasing, right? The number of deaths is decreasing because we've learned how to adapt because we're smart, intelligent people.
So on the fact of the number of deaths from extreme weather events, yes, those have gone down, and that's because we brought a lot of people out of poverty. But when you look at the
cheap fossil fuels providing cheap food.
But when you look at the predictions going forward, all of those gains will be lost because of the scale of the climate crisis. If you look at, and certainly I don't accept the fact that the number of extreme weather events has gone down. The number of extreme weather events has massively gone up, and the risk of things like floods, famines, wildfires have massively increased. And for example, let's just look at malnutrition, right? So actually, the number of people who are hungry has gone down over the last century, and that's because of progress of bringing people out of poverty.
With cheap fuel, partly because there's more CO2 in the world, which means the world is about 7 or 8% greener, which means we've got cheaper fuel, cheaper food, thanks to higher agricultural productivity, partly helped by cheaper fossil fuels. Excellent.
When you now look into the future, you actually see that all those gains that we have made over the last century are beginning to reverse because we are going past these tipping points where we are getting the benefits of tackling poverty.
So if we get... let's try another thing.
Nutrition.
How much CO2... Kush, how much CO2 is in the atmosphere?
It's just over 400 parts per million.
Right, so that's 0.04%, right?
Yeah.
So that's gone up a bit in the last few years from a record...
It's gone up a lot.
Yeah, from a multi-million year low of about 250 parts per million, OK? So CO2 levels are just above their multi-million year lows.
Are you a climate scientist? Because I don't think you're a climate scientist, and neither am I.
I can read the data. I tell you what, I can read the data, and I know that we've had CO2 levels much higher. Do you know what the average CO2 level is in the garden greenhouse?
Why don't you get an expert from NASA or an expert from the Met Office and ask them these questions? Because they will tell you quite categorically that what is happening now is man-made climate.
So what percentage of climate change and what percentage of CO2 emissions in the last 150 years is human relative to natural climate change? What percentage, Kush?
I don't know the precise percentage, but I'd say it's close to 100%. From the graphs that I've seen from the
goodness me! So there's no natural climate change in the last 150 years, even though there's been climate change for the last multi-million years?
Of the climate change that has happened in the last 150 years, it's almost entirely due to human causes.
Kush?
And I've seen a graph on that from the Met Office that was presented by Sir Patrick Vallance to our MPs.
Kush, time marches on, which means I've got to run to my next guest, but I'd be delighted if we can get you into the studio at some point, because it's really good to have these debates. We talk about it. I'm not a fan of the tactics of Just Stop Oil, but I am a fan of challenging this absolute climate madness that is going on. That is Dr. Kush Naker, a Just Stop Oil supporter. Apparently one of the other doctors who went on is a kind and compassionate person. I'm going to tell it as it is. There is nothing kind or compassionate about disrupting 80,000 people watching a rugby match. It's unbelievably selfish. No ifs, no buts. I'm going to calm down now because a good friend of mine is my next guest. Former MEP, very successful businessman who produces the most delicious salmon. Lance Foreman, I think, is with me.